Hello, Religion and Warfare students. So in this talk, I'm just going to go briefly over my responses to your response papers. So one thing, and I hope you found the reading on the Boxers interesting. I think they're a fascinating group. A lot of those articles, by the way, were from a book called History in Three Keys, which looks at how people during the time of the Boxers understood the Boxers, but then it also combines it with how people later on would look at the Boxers. And they've had an interesting history in China where they went from being kind of, for some Chinese, of course, especially those who joined, heroic figures, then figures who represented superstition, and then figures who should be celebrated because they were kind of proto-nationalists. And it's interesting that it was the communists in particular who focused on them as nationalists, since communism and nationalism theoretically don't go together, and communism claims to be scientific, and the Boxers were engaged in these kind of magical practices. In any case, it's fascinating how people interpret history, and we call that historiography. But that goes to one of the major points that was made by Joseph Escherich in that book, History in Three Keys. The idea of magic was that you had people at the time who thought that the magic worked and existed, and then you had other people who ridiculed them for believing that way. And Escherich's, one of his major points that I was glad most people got, was that magic can work, in a sense, even when it doesn't work, right? The idea is that, in a sense, whether or not these rites that they engaged in, whether or not they could stop bullets was not important. What is important is those rituals helped to motivate people and be willing to work towards some common goal. So from a social perspective or a political perspective, in terms of China defending itself from Western and Japanese imperialism, well, yeah, this idea of magic works just fine, right? It did mobilize the people together, and they did mount, in some places, effective resistance. So that's something to think about. What's also interesting is how people interpreted all this according to their own views. So one thing I should point out is that because of language issues, we tend to focus on Protestant missionaries and Protestant Chinese in the Boxer Rebellion. But actually, there were more Catholics in this time period, and a lot more Catholics died during the Boxer Rebellion. That's both because there were more Catholics, but also because the Catholics tend to be out in the countryside, and it was harder for them to get to safety. Typically, the Protestants tend to work in cities. Catholics had a long presence and often hid out in the countryside when Christianity was illegal. It was easier to hide, of course, in the countryside. And that's how they did their work. So there were lots of Catholics out in the countryside, so they were easier to attack. And what happened was a lot of Catholic churches were kind of built like fortresses. And there was a group of Boxers that surrounded one large Catholic church. And in it was the French bishop. And it was fascinating how the events that surrounded the siege, the attempt by the Boxers to take the church, which did not work, how both interpreted the events. So the Boxers claimed that the French Catholic bishop, and if you look at the picture of this guy, and you can see him in History of Three Keys, he looks like a wizard. He has this tremendously long beard. He's wearing this kind of traditional Catholic regalia. And the Boxers actually claimed that at night he would fly, like he would go in the air and fly and shoot fireballs at them. So he's kind of like Gandalf, I guess, which is kind of cool. And so it's interesting, right, that these Boxers gave to this Catholic bishop certain powers. They didn't say, well, Catholicism is a false religion, so it couldn't give you any power. That's not how they interpreted it at all. They also, what's fascinating is the Catholics at the same time claimed that they saw Jesus and Mary on horseback, like attacking the Boxers and helping them. So they did kind of have a shared view of a kind of magical reality, which I think is really fascinating. And so I think it's interesting, again, when you bring in these other perspectives and how the Catholics, when they would fight back, the Boxers would interpret that in ways that made sense to them. So, for example, the Catholics had a cannon in this battle, and it was able to kill Boxers. And there was this question, well, how is it that when we perform these magical rituals, they are not able to do that they're able to shoot us with the cannon? And the argument was that they would have a naked woman sit on the cannon when they fired it. And of course, the yin messed up their yang magic. So kind of curious stuff. As a quick aside, one other thing, if you are interested in this subject, there is a man named Gene Yong, who's a Chinese American and also a Catholic. And he's kind of a double minority, right? Because he's a Chinese American, so he's a minority. But also among Chinese people, most are not Catholics, right? So he made this very interesting, or I shouldn't say manga, but a graphic novel called Boxers and Saints. And the idea is he tells the story of the Boxer Rebellion in 2 volumes. One is Boxers, so it's from a boxer's perspective, and Saints is from a Catholic perspective. And guess what? Joan of Arc shows up, right? She's in there because the Catholic has visions of her. So it's kind of interesting, Joan of Arc had visions, and then this woman has visions too. So that's something you may enjoy. I actually interviewed the person for a podcast once, Gene Yong, and if you would like a link to that interview, I'd be happy to give it to you. Another thing I thought was interesting about looking at Boxers and Saints was looking at a more contemporary polytheistic religion. We start off a lot of this class looking at polytheistic religions, and we kind of shifted more and more over to monotheistic religions, which makes a lot of sense since oftentimes monotheistic religions, because they focus so much on this idea that there's one God and one kind of rule code you have to follow, it makes sense that they would develop very complex understandings of warfare. But I wanted us to see kind of a contemporary polytheistic religion, or more contemporary. And it was interesting that it was similar to kind of ethnic-based religion, right? Being Chinese means believing in the gods of the opera and performing these particular rituals and following this kind of morality. And it was kind of interesting, right? The Chinese are not interested in converting the missionaries to their religion. They just want them out. And there was this understanding that if you become a Christian and you're Chinese, you kind of cease being Chinese. So shifting over a little bit, we talked about, I wanted people to kind of see how World War II begins in China with Japan's invasion, how it begins in Asia in 1937. I wanted people to kind of see how one thing that would kind of prime Americans to being more hostile to Japan was the fact that Japan had invaded China and was doing some pretty bad things there. It's important to remember there were a lot of Christian missionaries still in China, and they were a very powerful lobby and often were quite good at relating stories back to the United States about what the bad things Japanese people were doing in China. And so we need to understand the centrality of China. And usually I'm not too strict on exact numbers, but I did ask you one of the questions to know how many Japanese troops are in China, right? And this is in 1945, and it was 5 million. And usually I'm not too big on those exact numbers, but the key thing is we want to understand the war in the Pacific. The war in the Pacific was terrible, but we were only fighting something like 1/6 of the Japanese army. The vast majority of the Japanese army was in China. And of course, as the United States got closer and closer to a position where it could invade Japan, they started pulling those troops out of China. So that's a lot of troops. That's a lot of soldiers to have to fight. And that's something that I want to stress, the Americans thought about in their war planning, if we want to understand why Americans use the atomic bomb. We also looked at how Japanese were reacting to the news of the war, both the invasion of China and the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this shows, again, the complexity when we're dealing with, I think, civilians and with memory. There's a tendency in Japan to kind of look back and say, well, it was all the military's fault. They were the bad guys doing all this stuff. And, the Japanese people weren't to blame. And it's kind of like, yeah, but you guys were pretty happy and supportive when they were doing all this. And we didn't talk about in this class, but I want to stress the military was able to take power in a large part because the military was popular and enjoyed large public support. So I want to stress that popularity was real. And Japanese people seemed quite enthusiastic about supporting the war effort when they were winning. Now, I think, to be fair, someone could easily point back, as that video clip made very clear, to amounts of information that the Japanese had, right? People had. They didn't necessarily know all the things that were going on. Mail was regularly censored from soldiers and so forth. But I did want to raise those complex issues because we think about civilians, this kind of comes up, is that they do take a part in the war. And that's one thing we also have to emphasize was, civilian workers do make stuff. They make bullets and airplanes that kill the enemy. So are they really non-combatants in a sense, especially when they're actually working? And basically the argument has been, well, you can kind of attack the factories, you can hit those factories, and it's up to the enemy whether or not they have workers in them or not. And if you do hit the workers, well, what were they doing? that seems to be kind of the basic argument that is often made. And this is something, I want to stress. People often talk about when they come up with the rules of war, they always emphasize don't hurt civilians. And I'm not against that. I think we should do our best to avoid hurting civilians. But what happens in this case with the United States was trying to knock out Japan's industrial capacity to prevent it from being able to wage war. And we try and do precision bombing, but they respond by dispersing factories into civilian neighborhoods. How do we deal with that? LeMay dealt with it by using napalm, which would destroy the factories and everything around them. Now, some people, I do want to note, said they had trouble catching. There was that question, who was LeMay? What was he like? It was in the video. There was a man who said, you did what he told you. Iron Pants LeMay is what we called him. And so LeMay, it was made very clear early in that video, was this guy who you didn't mess with. And I think you can kind of see that clearly with his ideas about he said, if we would have lost the war, I probably would have been tried as a war criminal. Now, I don't want you to think LeMay was amoral. I don't think he was amoral, but he was emphasized that, my job is to protect American lives. And he was haunted by the fact that, his orders could kill Americans. And that was his primary purpose, was defending American lives. And I think that guided American decision-making. They weren't too concerned with Japanese lives. At times they were, but not a whole lot. And so this raises a question of something we might call the issue of collateral damage. So unfortunately, war, sometimes people that you don't mean to kill will get killed. Civilians get caught in the crossfire. And a big issue is how much of that is acceptable. Anytime you're engaging in bombing, you're going to kill people who you don't mean to kill. Does that mean that bombing's wrong, or is there a certain amount that we can do, and so on and so forth? That's just something to kind of reflect on as we go into looking into more detail at the atomic bomb. One thing I do want to note with the duck and cover, with the white light, black rain, the white light is a reference to the flash of the atomic bomb, the flash of light and heat that can cause serious burning. And you saw some of the wounds that those people had suffered. And I always think it's kind of funny because people here will make fun of the old 1950s thing about duck and cover, where people were told, duck and cover your head and get under your desk. And it was like, ha ha ha, that would never protect you from an atomic blast. And it's like, yes, it would not protect you from a direct atomic blast. However, if you're in a building that collapses, having the ceiling fall on your desk rather than your head is good. If you're far enough away that you're not going to be killed instantly by the explosion, but you're going to be hit by heat that could burn you, again, covering your body is a good idea. And there were cases of, as you can see from those people, there, one side of their body could be completely burned and the other side would be just fine. And it was because one side was facing the heat blast. So this is one thing I just like to highlight, not simply because, it goes into this whole thing like, oh, let's make fun of the 1950s. Weren't they silly? Duck and cover. It's like, no, they had a good point. But also, a lot of times when we look back at history, we will, and we find ourselves, oh, those people were dumb. Why were they doing something like that? Oftentimes, they actually knew what they were doing. We just don't understand. And the job as a historian is to try and figure those things out. But with all that being said, excellent work. Keep it up. And I look forward to reading your discussion prompts and next response papers and all that. Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing. I know that some of the stuff we're doing is really, really disturbing and is not easy to handle. If you do feel like that is causing you a whole lot of anxiety to watch videos like this, do let me know, and we'll figure something out. I have this difficult balance as your professor. I do need to show you what really happened, and so you can think more about these things, and especially if we want to understand why we don't want to be hit by nuclear weapons, it's important to kind of see their effects. But at the same time, I also don't want to freak people out too much, especially during this whole COVID-19 thing, when we're already pretty much under a lot of anxiety. So if you face yourself facing issues like that, please do let me know.